So we are now recording. If you do need to leave early or anything, the fact that we're recording means that you'll be able to catch this at a later date. I think that's everything from me. So yeah, just keep talking in the chat and I'll monitor that and we'll go through everything at the end. So I'll hand over now to Amanda. And just for people who've joined since we started, if you put your view onto speaker view, it means that you'll just see the person speaking and you won't see all the little boxes. Okay, so Amanda.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Kate. Welcome everybody. We're delighted to be holding the first part of our Burnage, a Place Called Home symposium on housing. I'm Amanda Waite and I'm the Development Officer at Burnage Library, which is nestled at the heart of the Burnage estate built by Manchester Corporation in the 20s and 30s. And alongside my colleague Kate Turner for the last 2 years, we've been working with local tenants and residents to explore and celebrate the stories behind the estates through our Burnage, a Place Called Home project, which is funded by the Heritage Lottery. So we've delved into the archives, we've worked with volunteers, we've gathered oral histories, and we've looked at the history of the area, but also about the experiences of people living on the estates, people of all ages. We had planned to hold this symposium in Central Library alongside our exhibition, but as real life was seriously altered due to the pandemic, our plans have changed. So here we are online, and it's great because we're able to reach quite a different audience. So, you know, we're very pleased about that. So we're delighted to welcome four fantastic speakers to present their perspectives on 100 years of affordable housing. So we're hearing from today John Boughton, author of this fantastic book, Municipal Dreams, and his blog, which I thoroughly recommend, The Rise and Fall of Council Housing. That's a great read. John McCrory, who's from John Rylands Library, who worked on developing this project and has researched and written about the role of Manchester Corporation, specifically in the Burnage building of the Burnage estates. He's also a Burnage resident, so he knows what we're talking about. We have Dr. Martin Dodge, Senior Lecturer in Geography at Manchester University, and he is also co-authored one of my favourite books, Mapping Manchester. So if you're a map nerd, do get into that. Martin will be talking about some of the alternative ideas and designs for housing in the interwar period. Martin's also worked with Ali Ronan, who will be speaking next week at our second part of our symposium on looking at the growth of Burnage Garden Village as a community. And finally, we've got Councillor Suzanne Richards, the Executive Member for Housing and Regeneration at Manchester City Council. And she's going to bring us up to the present day with Manchester's vision for affordable housing. So, yeah, that's me. Welcome, everybody.
Okay, John, if you're ready to go, if you'd like to share your screen, and we'll start.
Yep. I'll just set that up. And can I take it that that's working correctly and everybody can see the front page and you can hear me okay? Great. Okay, well, thanks. Thank you for the invitation. I'm sorry not to be able to be in Burnage or Manchester to speak in person, but it's a great project and I've been really interested and happy to follow the good work you guys have been doing. Well, I was briefed to talk about municipal vision. And to begin with, of course, one has to acknowledge that the municipal vision was very heavily influenced, largely determined in many ways by national legislation and finance, and as well as that national trends in planning and design. So what I'm going to offer really is a little bit of a hybrid of those national dynamics and some examples of some of the more interesting and important local initiatives. Now, I've got to say that I'm covering a lot of history in a brief time, so I'm going to speak rather quickly, and I'm probably going to go through the slides rather quickly too. So I apologise for that in advance, and I'll try not to run over. That's my kind of main concern. So here we are, and here's, of course, you know, the origin of council housing. It lay in the pressing necessity caused by industrialisation and rapid urbanisation in the 19th century, slum housing on an unprecedented and concentrated scale. And the context, the background towards council housing, of course, is specifically the failure of the private sector to build the decent housing that working class people needed, both in town and country. So in a sense, the municipal vision was always a very simple one. It was simply decent sanitary housing, and ideally housing, of course, that was affordable likewise, but that was a problematic issue, as we'll see. So moving to the first major slide, you can see on the left-hand side what I designate as the first council housing built by Liverpool City Council. Liverpool City Council was a Tory-controlled council until 1956. That might seem unlikely currently, but it was the case. And St Martin's cottages, so-called, on the left-hand side, in fact, tenement housing, were the first sort of council housing of the contemporary era. Now, all these images you can see, despite appearances, are tenement housing, and this was a predominant form of council housing in its earliest years, culminating in Eldon Grove, which was really the kind of showpiece of the pre-war period, as far as Liverpool was concerned. The first council estate was built by the London County Council. I'll feature London fairly heavily, but try not to be too London-centric in my talk. And again, you can see the origins of this estate emerging in what was called a rookery, shown on the left-hand side of the slide. Charles Booth designated those black streets that you can see in the centre there as comprising of the lowest class vicious and semi-criminal. So this was one of the major elite dynamics behind council housing, that concern for so-called lower class immorality, criminality, alongside health concerns, etc. So you can see some early images of the boundary estate, and then of course, more importantly, you can see by contrast the municipal vision of the London County Council's housing of the working classes branch, which replaced that slum housing with the housing you can see illustrated in the current slide. Those wide streets, green open spaces, and of course the arts and crafts detailing that you can see in those still impressive tenement blocks on the right hand side. And the nice touch, I think, of the bandstand, and Owen Fleming, who was the lead architect, designated this as being for the pleasure of courting couples. So of course we always had that humane and humanistic vision behind council housing, as providing not only decent housing, sanitary housing, but a more culturally civilised environment. Manchester, of course, came pretty early on the scene. The Victoria Square dwellings on the left-hand side, which I think might be referenced later. Perhaps the council housing, council housing of longest continuous social housing heritage. Sanitary Street, as it was designated originally, better known to Manchester residents currently as Anita Street. But more importantly, I think for the sort of trends that we're following, on the right-hand side you can see Blakely, which was a garden suburb inspired by Ebenezer Howard and the Garden City movement. And this, for many housing reformers, local councillors, and members of the Labour movement, Labour activists, was, to quote the words of one Manchester City councillor, quote, more in keeping with an Englishman's idea of home, that he should have a cottage to himself and not occupy a portion of block dwelling rooms. So those garden city ideals, that garden suburb form, became a predominant form of council housing throughout its longer history. And those garden suburbs, although were better exemplified than, again, by the London County Council, these two examples that you can see on screen currently. Now, war, of course, is always the great dynamic of history, great locomotive of history, and what we all know, having recently sort of experienced the centenary of the 1919 Anzac, was that promise that Lloyd George made of a country fit for heroes. And you can see the kind of ideals exemplified in the illustration in the centre there. And of course, whilst Lloyd George was offering a promise of a better Britain, politicians of the time were equally concerned about working class unrest and even revolution. So it was always a sort of a twin impulse behind that ambition to build well in the post-First World War period. But in the early years, certainly you can see some really fine council housing, epitomising the standards and quality of the Tudor Walters report issued in 1918, covering post-war housing. Tudor Walters' ideal was cottage homes, as they were called, in groups of 4 to 6, no more than 12 to an acre, and that was very fully fulfilled in perhaps the finest post-war estate, the Dover House estate on the left-hand side. But with the council housing, of course, there was always a tension. There was a need not only to build decent, high-quality housing, but to build at scale to meet the pressing needs that existed. So the Beconshire estate on the right-hand side really represents an attempt to meet that housing need at scale, begun in 1921, built throughout the 20s and 30s, until in the end it comprised over 26,000 homes with a population of 120,000 people. And those type of estates subsequently were criticised as being rather uniform and monolithic, rather too overbearing in scale. So we'll look at later correctives to those perceived errors. Now, despite that promise in 1919, the reality was that public spending cuts were imposed in 1921, and housing was a major kind of victim of those public spending cuts, an early form of austerity. And so you can see a really kind of trend that developed, illustrated in rather simple terms here, through the interwar period in its case of Lancaster, from the very fine Addison housing on the left-hand side to more still decent housing, but more limited standard housing in the 1920s. And on the right-hand side, the Marsh estate, which was very much a slum clearance estate, built in the 1930s, and obviously to lower standards and to cheaper criteria. And the intention there was not only to save public money, but to make council housing affordable to those who could, the poorest working class, the people who were by the 1930s finally being cleared from the slums and rehoused. And affordability was one of the major issues of early council housing. If you remember the boundary estate, which I showed you, of the 5,100 people that lived on the former slum area, only 11 were able to move into the council flats. It was simply too unaffordable in most cases. So this was a corrective, but one unfortunately was brought at the cost of housing standards. Manchester City Council remained committed to those high standards, and predominantly, there are exceptions as we'll see, but predominantly to the garden suburb ideal. Wythenshawe, of course, was the prime example of that, 40,000 population by 1939, and Barry Parker's plan on the left-hand side really illustrated the ideal to the garden suburb movement in terms of its greenery, open space, cul-de-sacs, curving streetscapes, etc., etc. This really was the municipal vision writ large in this period. But as we referred to in the 1930s, tenant housing, inner city tenant housing does become a renewed necessity in order to rehouse that slum population. You can see what was a fairly ubiquitous form of tenant housing on the left-hand side in London and some of the other major cities, these 5-storey walk-up, balcony access houses. But by the 1930s, there were attempts to sort of improve the appearance and attractiveness of these estates, notably with the Oakland estate on the right-hand side, which kind of features this modern styling based on the ocean liners of the day. And again, the White City estate built at scale, but of more modern design. Few councils really embraced tenement living as such, but Liverpool was an exception. And you can see some examples of Liverpool's sort of tenement estates in the interwar period. Lancelot Key, who was the city architect for Liverpool, talked about an A1 community in a properly planned township of flats, and you can see that particularly on the right hand side there. You can see the shops included, a children's feeding centre, etc. So this was an attempt to bring tenement living and community forms into the present day. Much to the kind of chagrin of architects in the UK, there's very little modernism, modernist styling amongst municipal architecture. But just a couple of exceptions. I won't talk about Kent House because I'll touch on later. But you can see Quarry Hill, which is really the finest and fullest example of this in the pre-war period, both designed by R.H.A. Livet as Deputy Architect for Manchester and City Architect for Leeds. Quarry Hill subsequently demolished both of these, of course, but Quarry Hill really a full community. I'm going to talk quickly and rush on. I'm sorry to be so quick. Again, we come to war and the war impetus to housing reform and renewal. And I think probably perhaps the main ideal of the main sort of dynamic to come from the Second World War, of course, was that promise of a better Britain, exemplified in Abraham Payne's post on the left of Beveridge, bought 630,000 copies sold in the interwar period. The notion of planning, which was a really key idea of the post-war period, nowhere better exemplified by the County London plan, but of 200 or 300 across the country. This poster, my favourite in the book, favourite illustration in the book, is actually from was created by British prisoners of war in a German prison camp. That's the spread of the planning ideal in the interwar period. And finally, of course, the landslide Labour victory in 45 intended to implement some of these promises and ideals. So there was, in the post-war period, a broad consensus between both major parties. Labour built 805,000 council homes in this 6-year period of its government. Howard Macmillan in 1953 built 229 council homes, the largest in a single year. So to that degree, there was a consensus on the form of nature of council housing, but Labour, and particularly Bevan, saw it as serving a cross-section of the population, serving general needs, what Bevan famously called the living tapestry of a mixed community. And the 1949 Housing Act was the first to remove the stipulation that working class housing be designated, that council housing be designated as specifically housing the working classes. This was the ideal of 49. It was fairly rapidly overturned by the Tory government which succeeded, which abolished the general needs subsidy. But for the time being, of course, council housing at scale remains a pressing priority of governments of both stripes. So we referenced planning, and as I said earlier, some of these planning ideals were to correct what was perceived as errors of the interwar period, such as Becontree. So one of the big ideals was neighbourhood units. This was exemplified in its finest form in the Lansbury estate in East London, built for the 1951 Festival of Britain, fully self-contained community with not only housing but schools, shops, health clinics, etc., etc. The other major ideal to emerge from the post-war period was mixed development, and this notion that council housing, rather than merely serving families, 2-3 bed family homes, as was overwhelmingly predominant in the 1920s and 30s, should serve people in with a range of housing needs and a range of housing stages, housing for the elderly, of course, housing for single people, as well as those 2-3 bed family homes. Sumford Grove, Frederick Gibbard, and the Orlando estate being nice examples of both those. Just want to talk about here. I mean, to be honest, most council housing architecture was fairly standard, often sort of plain neo-Georgian. But certainly the London County Council Architects Department, which was the largest and the most progressive, in some ways the best regarded in the world in the 1950s, over 1,500 staff, 250 qualified architects in the housing division alone. Within those 250, there was a significant kind of conflict between those who favoured what was described as a kind of Scandinavian New Humanist vision, sort of a more picturesque form. You can see in the centre there, Alton East, and those who favoured a kind of more brutalist, Le Corbusier inspired style, exemplified on the right-hand side by Boughton West. Streets in the sky, deck access was another attempt to foster community, to kind of recreate what was perceived as the working class community of the slum terraces. Park Hill, which is a very successful estate for most of its life, is the finest example of that. In Sheffield, you can see both the artist's vision and the large-scale implementation of that. Over almost 1,000 flats, 4 pubs, 42 shops, health centres, etc. A really fully contained urban village in many ways. But the pressing need into the 50s and 60s is, in a more affluent Britain, is to finally end the scourge of the slums. And slum housing remained on a huge scale across the country. You can see examples in Manchester here, but these were replicated across the country. And this issue lay behind really the mass public housing drive of the late 50s and 60s. And you can see the ambition of Birmingham City Council here in not only clearing those inner city slums, but rebuilding at scale in large peripheral estates. Birmingham built 464 high-rise blocks in the 60s and early 70s. And high-rise, of course, becomes a form associated with council housing this time. Unfairly to some degree, because 2/3 of council housing built between 45 and 79 was two-storey conventional brick-built housing, but the prevalent image becomes high-rise, seen in the Lawn, 11 stories, a very small scale first example of a point block. Those architects designed Dennis Lasdon, Erno Goldfinger blocks in the centre, and the Sentinel's at 32 stories, the highest residential point block built by a local authority. System building, of course, is associated with this, and some of the problems that emerged from that. The Freemasons estate featured the Bowman Point block, which of course collapsed catastrophically in 1968. The Hume Crescent, which many of you will know, you may not know of it so much from its kind of the architectural vision, but of course it did become problematic, and it was those problem estates which sometimes gave council housing its kind of predominant journalistic image, at least, whilst obviously estates like Burnage, etc., and so many more continue to provide good homes for many millions. So I don't want to end on that negative. What I want to emphasise very strongly is that, for me, I think the 1970s were actually a golden age of council housing, and you can see what was really predominant form there: low-rise, high-density correctives of some of the areas of the 60s and 70s, built here by various councils, Lambeth and Camden in London, Norwich City Council in the centre there. And this was an area in the 1970s when 49% of architects worked in the public sector, and that loss of expertise and skill has been obviously one of the major issues that local authorities face to the present day. And finally, my final slide, and I think it's really good to end on a very positive note, this Goldsmith Street in Norwich, the winner of the 2019 Sterling Prize for Architecture from the Royal Institute of British Architects, 100% social housing, passive house, energy efficient, beautiful design, and really fine quality housing, which I think represents not only the best of past ideals, but hopefully the promise of future ideals also. And with that, I'll end. Thank you for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, John. Thank you for that real whistle-stop tour. I'm sorry to have to condense you to that time. You could have gone on for a long time, I'm sure. We'll hand over now to John McCrory.
Thank you, Kate, and thank you, John. Can you see my screen? Right, so I'm going to focus on the interwar housing built here in Burnage, where the project was based. It wasn't the first, it wasn't the largest. Frankly, there's nothing exceptional about it, but its story offers a representative view of the broader experience, not just locally, but nationally. The first post-1919 developments in Manchester were all of a similar ilk, cottage style, low density estates, built onto the green space within the city's narrow and confined boundaries. These estates have typically nestled well into the city's fabric, if not caused a fuss. They've worked and are seldom thought about, which I think is perhaps the ultimate testament to their success. you can see all the estates in the south of Manchester here, excepting Wythenshawe, and it comprises a significant part of the city. A very great achievement. So here we look at Burnage. This is Burnage just prior to the First World War and before the Garden Village as well. It was a broadly agricultural area, lots of farms, but also with significant numbers of industrialists as well, and very middle class. We can see at the top left, the city is encroaching into it, so its bucolic days are very much numbered at this point. But the first major development in Burnage wasn't municipal, it was the Garden Village, which was a garden suburb, which Ali Ronan will talk about next week in much greater detail. But its principles of low density housing, ensuring maximum light and air, houses with bathrooms, hot and cold water, electric lights, would almost act as a prototype for what would become the minimum standards for social housing that were laid down in the Tudor Walters reports of 1918, I think. So this is an amended diagram of one that did appear in the report itself, showing, as John mentioned earlier, the humane vision at the heart of social housing. So this shows that at the winter solstice, so at the depths of winter, the idea was that building low density houses would allow there to be sunlight in the lower stories for up to 4 hours. So it was, I say, very humane. They were predominantly cottage houses. So this is a plan of one of the houses from Burnage. Semi-detached houses, which are replicated, of course, not only here, but all over the country. They would have space for sizable gardens, front and back, again, allowing maximum light and ventilation. Privacy as well, people wouldn't be overlooking you. And there'd be space for growing food, and safe places for children to play. And inside as well, they aimed for 3 decent sized bedrooms, indoor bathroom, indoor toilet. So they really wanted a high minimum standard of housing. And the state was willing to subsidise it to ensure that happened. And focusing on the developments in Burnage, so we look at a closer aspect of that map I showed earlier, we can see how, while if you were to drive through, you think it was one single estate, but it's not. It's formed of, I think, there are 6 different components to it, built under 3 different housing acts, which do significantly shape the area and the houses that were built, and the sort of feel of the place as well. It's a brief table here showing the chronology of house building in Burnage. And what we see initially is just the overwhelming majority were built under the 24 Housing Act, which was the first act passed by the Labour government, which really sought to increase the subsidy that was given for building to rent. And it managed to solve some of the tensions that existed with trying to get labour to work on them. So trying to get workers. The workers were reassured by Labour's promises, and when they began augmenting their numbers, it finally allowed house building to actually occur in the numbers that they'd originally intended. You can see that the first Housing Act was 1923, where we see developments in Burnage, and the final one was 1930, but these are quite small developments in comparison. And what we also see, after having conceded the legitimacy of municipal house building, and also conceded the idea of state subsidy, the Conservative battlefield really turned to, well, who will build these houses? Will it be left to the private construction firms, those who know their job, or will it be a step closer towards socialism, and will they be built by in-house works departments? And we can see that the early developments are all private, but with Kingsway, the largest development, there was quite a bad-tempered debate and vote on it. There was a very strong contingent arguing for in-house works development, but they were beaten by the Conservative interest. But we see later on that the final 2 developments were built by direct labour. So again, breaking down just the sheer numbers, we see overwhelmingly the majority of the Burnage estate was built under the Wheatley Act. But the first act that affects Burnage was the 1923 Chamberlain Act, which was passed by Neville Chamberlain, the Minister of Health, under that Conservative government. its primary focus was on private house building, allowing people to buy because they wanted to kickstart that industry again because it never recovered from the outbreak of the war. And so we see here a typical shot of just 4 semi-detached houses, not at all typical, not at all limited to Burnage. You see this all over Manchester, all over the country. But the first municipal development was called the Burnage estate, where there were 666 houses. We can see it overwhelms the existing small settlement here. We can see it, the garden village here on the left-hand side. We can see it's dominated by a boulevard called Irwood Road that was built by direct labour, an unemployed relief effort in the early 1920s. And we can also see very generous provision for public space and parks. Crinkle fields, playing fields here, and a park there. They were determined this place would never be a slum. It would never, ever be allowed to happen again. The land was bought primarily from the main landowner, who was Lord Egerton. He wasn't hostile to it, but the corporation and his agent haggled over the price, which eventually went to arbitration. And the housing minutes are littered with reports of farmers asking for compensation because of the great losses that they will incur from these compulsory purchases. But while there was some sympathy, the drive was that these houses would be built, and they were. Now we see here some of the tenders that were offered from private construction companies to the corporation. We see 8 tenders offered, and it was Gerard and Sons who won the first tender. And in the bottom image here, we can see the different types of housing that were built. So it wasn't one uniform type. There were 2 and 3 bedroom houses, 2 classes, Class A and Class B. Class A were less expensive. They didn't have a parlour, and Class B, of course, had a front parlour. What you find in the first estate here at Burnage is that there's a far greater proportion of B-class houses than A, and that was later thought to be a mistake because they were beyond the reach of most people. Now, the great issue at this period as well was actually getting these houses built. The money was largely there, that the will was there, and that the demand was there, but they couldn't get workmen. There was a massive shortage of labour. And of course, the massive investment that got into house building and housing and construction in general saw a huge boom in construction prices, price of materials as well. So this is a report from Ernest Simon visiting the Burnage estate, where he describes there's over 600 houses here to be built, and he found 4 bricklayers and 5 apprentices employed on the job. We have a table here from the housing minutes from July 1924 showing Burnage, where there's 1 foreman and 2 bricklayers. Almost a year later, there's only 7 bricklayers and 2 apprentices. So it was painstakingly slow, and Ernest Simon discusses this in great detail in his book, just the absolute the massive efforts they had to take just to try and get these things up. But we see an aerial shot here of the Burnage estate when it was constructed, and we can see just how open it is, how light it is. We can see the playing fields here, the park up here, and again dominated by the treeless boulevard of Irwood Road. But we see an image of Irwood Road now, and it's quite beautiful, I think. And with Burnage, we do see so much of the best of the period. We see spacious, high-quality housing with sizable fronts and back gardens, sited in well-landscaped green surroundings. I think it really is one of the best-looking of the Manchester estates. Here we have the bottom of Irwood Road again, so it carries on, and Greenham Road, and there are similar such examples all around the estates. But it wasn't. There was far more than that too. So on Burnage, we saw some of the earliest houses built with electric in Manchester. And on Irwood Road, on that boulevard, we have an open electrical house where people could walk in and see the wonders of electricity and all these new labour-saving devices that would usher in a better life. But equally, with Burnage, we see many of the shortcomings of the interwar housing period as well. This was the land reserved for Burnage Library. Didn't materialise. It was cut in the 1930s, and It took a massive effort on behalf of the residents to finally get a library building, and that story continues to this day. But social provisions and amenities were not the priority. The focus was overwhelmingly on housing. We see a small example here of another body building houses too. This was just around the corner on the Burnage estate, on the land of the Burnage estate. We see 40 houses built for the co-op, and they would offer houses to their workers for rental. And we see one of those houses in the course of construction, just there. The next development was the Burnage estate, which was immediately to the south, a mixture of municipal houses and also some private houses to be built for sale as well. The largest development began in 1926, which was the Kingsway estate, which we discussed earlier. So this happened after the truce with the Labour movement. They were promised 15-year building plans, which allowed them to augment their numbers to such a degree that the price of labour and the price of construction did come down. But equally, it shows, we see on the Kingsway estate, houses built of different materials. These are coralite houses where you were trying to eliminate the need for bricklayers by just building houses from concrete instead. So a mixture of concrete and aggregate. There were 138 of those built on Kingsway. But what you saved in bricklayers, you had to invest more in plasterers, and the plasterers were even more expensive than the bricklayers. So it didn't really work out, but it does show the degree to which the corporation were not complacent, were innovative, and were desperate to get these houses built as efficiently as possible, and were always open to new and more effective methods. We see an image of the Kingsway estate here completed, and named after the dual carriageway that runs through is called Kingsway. But this image was also used in the 1945 plan, very same image, discussing the progress to 1945. And it says how the housing estates were an improvement, but the people live on main traffic routes, noisy, a danger to their children. They have no meeting places, no community life. So the shortcomings of these estates were noted early on. The next development was the Lady Barn estate, and it's over 1,000 houses. So I think, as John mentioned earlier as well, at this point, the people were conscious that these houses were very, very expensive. They were beyond the means of most people to pay. So they shrank the size of the houses a bit, and they also moved the toilets downstairs as a further means of trying to bring the price down in sort of desperate attempt to make them available to the poorest people. The next addition was the Green End estate. Now, what's notable about this was it was all constructed by direct labour. So finally, the opposition had relented by this point, and so this was all, the Green End estate was totally done within Manchester by the Manchester municipal authorities. At this point, people are questioning, is this working? And we have Lord Simon again, so the first chair of the Housing Committee, saying that Manchester has hitherto been housing the middle classes and the aristocracy of labour, and has done almost nothing for the lowest paid workers. With the passing of the 1930 Housing Act, which rather than focus on vast amounts of house building as the previous ones had, it aimed or demanded that the slums were given attention, and that the worst housing in the city was demolished and their residents housed elsewhere. So we see a small element of that in the final development in Burnage on Avon Road, where 62 houses were again to be built by direct labour on the site that was reserved for the library. So from the housing minutes, we see one of the condemned areas. This was St Clement's, just behind Piccadilly. And there are also residents from Collyhurst, West Gorton, and Anchorage as well. So this is just a typical street from that area, Sparkle Street it was called, after it had been demolished. But so residents were moved from there to Burnage, so that the final development built on these small gaps that were left after the early development. And we see in contrast to what John mentioned earlier in Lancaster, these were actually the highest quality houses in Burnage, and they were known locally as the Wythenshawe houses. But what's quite interesting is over the course of under 20 years, we see that the houses in Burnage going from being beyond the reach of the poorest and being built for the most respectable, the aristocrats of working classes, to its poorest. I think that's quite a transformation in a very short period of time.
Thank you, John. We'll now move on to Martin Dodge. You're ready? John, if you just stop sharing your screen. There we go.
You hear me and you can see my slides. So I'm very pleased to be able to contribute. Thanks to Amanda and Kate for the invitation. So I want to really focus in on a particular period, the 1930s, and kind of following on quite nicely in some ways from what John McCrory was just saying about the shift in emphasis in kind of public housing in Manchester to deal with the kind of ongoing concern about slum clearance and the not necessarily the failure, but the kind of concerns about the limits of building semi-detached cottages on at low density on kind of open land. So the focus much more in the 30s, the mid-30s, was about the inner cities using smaller plots of land that have been cleared to build flats. So the drive here partly was from national government, the kind of Greenwood, the 1930 Housing Act, the Greenwood Act, shifting subsidy that enabled higher density flats to be developed, and the kind of influence from continental cities and the kind of ideas of kind of modernist architecture coming through in the design. So in Manchester, in the kind of mid-late 30s, there are about 6 kind of major schemes of kind of blocks of flats and some other smaller developments. So in total, about 9,000 flats were built. So this is one here, Hayward House, one example. So they were kind of 3 or 4 story, often brick built, about 40 homes to the acre. They had some communal facilities and quite generous open space allowed around the flats, but obviously no kind of gardens, no private space in comparison to the kind of the development of cottage housing. The flats themselves, 2 or 3 bedroom generally. They were considerably better equipped than the houses that most of the tenants were moved from, with indoor plumbing, some kind of cooking facilities, electricity, good sized rooms, and in particular the kind of focus on light, getting light into the rooms with big windows, and almost all the flats had a small private balcony. So 6 major schemes in the mid to late 30s. 2 of the most interesting ones, so I'll look at 3, but firstly 2 of the most interesting ones, I think, Greenwood House and Kingsley Wood House, and they're quite odd in terms of the kind of process of naming them. So they were named after ministers of health who were responsible for housing. So Greenwood House was named after Arthur Greenwood, the Labour Minister of Health in the early 1930s, and Kingsley Wood House was named after the Conservative Minister of Health in the mid to late 1930s, and they were both opened in 1936, kind of formally, officially opened by Sir Kingsley Wood, but he was also opening Greenwood House, and Arthur Greenwood was in attendance as well. So the kind of opening ceremony is kind of reported in the Manchester Guardian as quite a ceremony. The Greenwood House, the aerial photograph here from the late 1930s shows it really standing out in the kind of urban landscape of kind of West Gorton, just off Kirksman Hume Lane, just by Bellevue Pleasure Gardens, and the large addition to it. It's 204 flats, mostly 2 and 3 bedroom flats. Some facilities, a central wash house in the middle here, a club room, a playground, and shops. Kingsley Wood House in Collyhurst, just off of Rochdale Road, so a very striking aerial photograph from the period, showing the kind of large clearance area. And I think this curved shape is Kingsley Wood House, and then there was some other blocks of flats in a kind of adjacent development, so 169 flats, and the larger area, nearly 1,000 flats. So 2 of the developments of this period. But I want to focus a little bit more on one particular development. And John Boughton kind of mentioned this very briefly in his talk, Kennet's House, and it's one of the kind of real architectural kind of icons, I guess, for interwar Manchester. And this is a perspective architect sketch of what it looked like, and the kind of plan view. So a very distinctive elliptical shape development, 181 flats, running from 5-storey, so that it was a awkward sloping site that it was developed. So at the top end, 5 stories high, down to 2 stories. It was built for £83,000. Very striking architectural design, as we'll see in a minute with some of the photographs of it. There's a really fascinating short used clip, and I think Kate distributed the web link. Unfortunately, we can't easily show the clip within this presentation. But this is Leonard Hayward in his suit and bowler hat. He was the director of housing in the 1930s, responsible for Kennet House. And he presents a model of the development and explains the kind of the benefits for the slum dwellers who will be moved into this. And in particular, he stresses the open space and the light that will be flowing into these flats. So if you get a chance, it's really fascinating to watch this little clip. Some other people think that the actual architectural design wasn't Hayward's. Leonard Hayward, the director, was actually his understudy, Richard Levitt, who again, we've seen a little bit. So he was the deputy director of housing in Manchester for a while, but moved to Leeds and was responsible for another kind of architectural icon in terms of interwar public housing, the Quarry Hill estate, which obviously has very similar architectural commonalities to it. But just back to Kennet House. So here there's some really interesting architectural photographs from when it was completed. I'm not sure if residents had moved in at this point. These were kind of publicity photos taken to register the architecture of it. So this is the main entrance portal for the development. Very obvious kind of modernist influences in terms of the lines, the banding, the symmetry, the kind of repetition. Very strong kind of iconic design of that period. So the entrance portal is quite angular, but actually the development itself is very curved and very striking in that sense. This is a view of the interior of the development. again, these are kind of publicity shots. So everything's literally probably just about to be planted. The trees and the lawn just freshly laid and stuff like that. So this is the interior of it. You can see the kind of sloping ground and the height of the blocks diminishes into the distance. And the design of it was a very striking shape in the landscape, and has often been referred to as a kind of ocean liner in terms of its lines and the kind of profile it presents. So these are publicity shots from when it opened, and then we skip forward several decades. These are photographs from the 1970s, the early 1970s, which show some maintenance work going on, and the interior view from the 1970s. Again, the kind of physical fabric has obviously decayed to some degree. The problems of maintenance of these buildings and the kind of amenity space that was celebrated in terms of gardens and playgrounds in the centre has been colonised by the kind of demon of the post-war age. The car has taken over and swallowed up kind of amenity space. So the 1970s, the decline, and this is just before the development was demolished in the end of the 1970s. So a photograph, quite a sad photograph of the entrance portal boarded up prior to demolition. This is what Kennet House is now. So in some ways the shape remains a bit in Climb Bank, but the style of housing is very much more killer built with slate roofs and with conventional roofs and front doors. But the community, the sense of community and some of the feelings around Kennet House remain quite active. So there's a very interesting Facebook group dedicated to residents and people interested in the development, and quite a lot of activity discussing what it was like to actually live in the development. So I'll just round off just by a little shameless plug for the book that I co-wrote a couple of years ago. So it doesn't have anything about 1930s flats, but it does have some chapters on different aspects of housing in Manchester. So I'll finish there. Thank you.
That's lovely. Thank you, Martin. Some really lovely photographs there. We're now going to go on to Councillor Suzanne Richards, who will bring us up to the now and even beyond. So, Suzanne, when you're ready.
Am I unmuted now? Right, I shall start again.
Mute, and I was muted, I'm sorry.
Right, start again. Thanks very much, Kate and Amanda, for inviting me to take part in today. I'm really hoping at some point to be able to see the exhibition and all the work that you've been doing in its entirety in Central Library, so that it gets the recognition that it deserves. It's actually been a piece of work quite close to my heart for reasons you'll discover as I continue through the presentation. I think really COVID-19 and the last 6 months has probably taught us more than ever the importance of safe, secure and affordable housing. But Manchester's long recognised the importance of council housing for more than 100 years. This photo you've already has already been referenced today, this scheme, which is Victoria Square in Ancoats, built over 125 years ago. It still has City Council tenants living there, and recently featured in a Granada TV programme looking at how cities are equipped to deal with an ageing population. And our residents in this block, I think, quite proudly challenge the stereotype of young city dwellers. I think the heritage of the building and the beautiful landscaping not only makes these 165 homes attractive to tenants, but they've also provided a source of income for Northwards, our arm's length management organisation, with TV crews from Cracker to Peaky Blinders having filmed there. As you've already heard this morning from the 1919 Addison Act, kick-started a further wave of new council house home building for our First World War heroes, including these properties in Cheetham Hill in the north of the city. Unfortunately, due to losses through right to buy, many are no longer owned by the council. But these properties and those at Victoria Square were really built to last. I obviously wasn't around when they were built, but I do have a strong family connection to the later waves of housing that were built in the city. This is me giving my granddad a selfie lesson, but he was a former resident of Burnage. He was in his working life a brickie for the then Manchester Corporation, and I had a hand in building council homes right across the city. I think it's important today to acknowledge the role of those skilled tradespeople like my grandfather, who built us quality housing that is still standing today. The benefits, I think, of local employment and the additionality that house building, when done right, can bring is something we understand and value as a council. And it's why house building is going to be a central part of Manchester's COVID recovery plan over the next 5 years and beyond. Back in the heyday of council housing, we had over 100,000 homes that were owned by the City Council. Now we have around 66,000, mainly social rented homes, and 50,000 of which are managed by our registered provider partners in the city, 16,000 owned by the council and managed in a number of different ways. One area where we own housing is West Boughton, once infamous for the Shameless TV show. We're now close to finishing the regeneration of this estate where 2,000 people live. We've worked with developers Keepmo and registered provider Guinness Partnership, and we've been able to reinvest capital receipts from the scheme into a new community hub and a shop and a doctor's surgery, and we've also built a nursery for the school with a new community centre. I think what would have once been described as an area with many challenges is now a largely successful mixed tenure community, with a local primary school that's gone from failing to outstanding. The final piece of our kind of regeneration jigsaw in this area was opened for residents and gratefully received during lockdown, and it's what's known as a sponge park. It's a model for how green spaces can help us tackle the effects of climate change. Its design helps reduce the risk of local flooding, and it creates a kind of a more attractive, healthier environment for the residents in West Boughton to enjoy. I think this has been a particularly successful regeneration project because we work so closely with the local community in the area. And I think the key to any successful regeneration from a housing perspective has to be working closely with and safeguarding the existing community. We've seen examples elsewhere where this hasn't worked so well. But I think ensuring that residents feel ownership and involvement in the regeneration process is key. We have 3 regeneration projects that were funded by what is the off-maligned private finance initiative programme. These photos are of our Brunswick estate, which is just 5 minutes walk south of the city centre. The scheme will refurbish 653 council homes and will do external works to 198 privately owned homes. Plus, we're providing 200 new homes for social rent, including 60 new extra care apartments. And on top of that, 277 homes for sale. Our focus here again has been on quality, and many of our speakers this morning have referenced the importance of quality, and we've worked closely with the community. And although I think that there have been issues in building new homes within a very tight geographical area, whilst people are still living there, we do enjoy high levels of resident satisfaction. However, I would say we've probably learned the hard way that PFI contracts are inflexible to cope with the necessary changes that come up along the way, and that are just not predictable at the beginning of a 25, 30-year contract. Ultimately, they create a contractual environment within which any change is difficult and expensive. The majority of our council-owned homes are managed by Northwoods, our arm's length management organisation, and we have a need within our housing revenue account to replenish properties lost through right to buy, and we've recently completed 60 new homes on a number of small sites. We're currently in the midst of a review of our ALMO, which sees the council minded to take back direct management of our housing for the first time in 15 years. And I think that's a route being followed by many other local authorities who still own council housing at the moment. For our next scheme, we are looking to build on a site called Silk Street in the Newton Heath area of the city. It's a really brilliant location. It's 3 miles from the from city centre on the canal, but the area surrounding community has some of our lowest incomes in the city. The site is currently, which you can see there, an underused car park, and we want to ensure that we can really capitalise on that canal side location and see it reinvigorated as quality new social housing, to help those on their housing register and those residents who want to right size. We'll be delivering 69 council homes, and there's going to be a focus on modern methods of construction, low carbon, and for our apartments, the age-friendly approach, which is a design approach called Happy, which some people may be aware of. We're hoping to start on site next summer and complete the autumn of the following year. I think it would be remiss of me really not to paint too rosy a picture of delivering council housing as a local authority today. I think we do face huge challenges. Loss of properties through right to buy at a huge discount makes long-term financial planning extremely difficult. In Greater Manchester, we've also committed to zero carbon for new build housing by 2025 and retrofit by 2038, which is going to initially come at a considerable cost, but one which I think we must meet in order to ensure Manchester remains a sustainable and livable city. Following the Grenfell tragedy, we also have wider fire safety remediation works to undertake and have committed to installing sprinklers in our council-owned high-rise. Ahead of us, we also have the huge financial challenge of COVID-19 and its impact on our funding. We have, in the last 10 years, been relatively resilient as a local authority because we've been able to generate income, and we receive income as a shareholder in Manchester Airport. But already the combined financial impact in increased costs and reduced income of the coronavirus crisis is estimated at 167 million for us, and that's this year alone, bearing in mind that, you know, some of those income receipts will not pick up for up to 3 years. Manchester, though, when faced with a challenge, always tries to seek to innovate and find a way through. And I wanted to reference 3 approaches in particular, which will help us to increase the delivery of housing over the next 10 years and beyond. Those who've watched Mindtopia will have seen reference to 2 of the city's joint ventures, which have been established to deliver regeneration in the city. Manchester Life was set up in 2014 to deliver housing for Manchester's growing professional population, and to restart the regeneration of the Ancoats area. The next phase of that development in Ancoats has identified 3 sites for affordable housing, which will be delivered in partnership with Great Places, but also through the council's new local delivery vehicle, which I'll come to later. The Northern Gateway Partnership, which you can see the image of one of our first phases on the screen now, was established in 2017, and will see £1 billion of investment delivering 15,000 homes over the next 20 years. The first phase in Collyhurst includes 270 new homes, and 130 of those will be council housing. Finally, 2 other approaches that we're taking are, one is working in partnership with our registered providers in the city through the Manchester Housing Providers Partnership, and we've called it Project 500 for want of a better name. But what we have done is identified small sites of up to 25 homes per site right across the city, which will deliver 500 new homes on council land. That will be investing our land resources as a council to support the delivery of social and affordable housing with our social landlords in the city. As I've already mentioned, we are in the process of establishing as well our own local delivery vehicle, even working with our existing social landlords and with some of the new landlords, social landlords that are coming into the city. It's unlikely that we'll reach the target set in our residential growth strategy. We don't really understand fully yet the economic impacts of COVID-19 on development, and I think really probably for some of our social landlords it's going to mean a slowing down of their development programmes as they rightly take stock and manage the financial impact. So in this climate, I think our housing delivery vehicle is all the more important. It will help us to ensure a pipeline of affordable homes at or below local housing allowance level, and we believe has the potential to deliver up to 2,000 homes by 2025. It will use a mixed tenure approach of both market rent and affordable housing, which then means that through cross-subsidy, and affordable housing development, which on its own would have been financially difficult, becomes viable. It will allow us to effectively use our council land for the delivery of housing that is affordable for Manchester residents. And I think a council-owned delivery vehicle has the potential also to help lead the recovery of Manchester housing market and help us to meet our ambition that every resident has access to a safe, secure, sustainable home that is most importantly affordable to them. Finally, I wanted to end with a message to government. I've already touched on the impact of right to buy when public finance is so tight. The risk councils face when building council housing at scale of losing properties, and the investment in them is extremely challenging. But for cities like Manchester, we often have the additional financial challenge of land remediation, as we're mainly building on brownfield sites, some of which have long and quite colourful histories. There's also the investment needed in the infrastructure around our housing, so that we can ensure that we're building strong and sustainable communities. Too often it's treated as a competitive lottery by government, and one which sees funds diverted south, leaving huge challenges for cities like Manchester that want to build at scale and need the security of long-term infrastructure funding for housing delivery. And then finally, I think we need better access to and long-term planning for grant funding for affordable housing. We have in Manchester been mapping out our delivery up to 2028 and beyond for a number of years. Yet actually the Affordable Homes Programme post 2021 has only just this month been announced by government. We have a need to build council housing in the city. There's a desire to build it, and we now need government to work with us at a regional level to create an environment where we can work together and deliver it.
That's fab. Thank you, Suzanne. I think that's a lot of food for thought for all of us. We have had a question, which I think probably best for John McCrory, about how houses in Burnage were originally allocated to people.
I'm not entirely sure. I've seen a list somewhere whereby there were 4 categories of prospective tenants, top of which were members of the armed forces who were letting. So I think certainly early on, armed services, so your service history was quite an important determinant as to whether you get social housing. And ability to pay as well was extremely important early on. You see that transform, or that change as time went on. But
Yeah, I think I know that page you're referring to, John. It's in the minutes at Manchester Central Library's archives department. We can send you a reference over, Judith. I've got your email from before, so we can do that. If anybody does have any questions, please do pop them in now while we round up. It's been really brilliant. I hope that you've all learnt something and enjoyed yourselves. And thank you to all of our speakers. Had a question down here. Could Ali tell us about the crowdfunding for the Burnage Garden Centre? This about Burnage Garden Village. Next week, I'm not sure if any of you have seen, but next week we do have another of these webinars which will focus more on the community side of things. So as John McCrory was saying, there weren't necessarily the community provisions built in, but next week we'll talk about how the people in these suburbs got around that and the types of things that they did to build their own communities. Ben Clay, novel methods of construction do not always have a great history in this story. What do we think should be the qualities of a new generation of homes built in a non-traditional way that would ensure we avoid these issues in the future? I suppose that's open to the floor. If anybody's got any thoughts.
Well, I certainly agree that modern methods of construction, which is a bit of rebranding, have not been very successful in the past. Have been, prefabrication. Prefabrication was promoted in the 1920s. It was promoted in the 1950s. It was promoted on a large scale with system building in the 1960s. And each of those were very kind of laudable attempts to build at scale, to build rapidly at scale. And nearly all of them were flawed. It tends to be traditional brick-built housing which is most successful. So I think in terms of the question of the qualities of new housing, I think is to learn from those mistakes. And I'm obviously not a construction engineer, but I do think we have to be properly sceptical about sort of promises of MMC, modern methods of construction, and really look at the build quality and design characteristics of what's being offered, because it's not for me an easy or easy response. Someone is often actually quite flawed in the longer term.
I'd just add, if I can, as well. Sometimes there's a debate about whether the architectural design and the construction lead to bad housing, or is it more about the kind of the long-term maintenance and the management and the kind of tenant landlord kind of relationships. And often the blame, I think, for failures in the past has been put at inadequate architectural design, when actually that's not necessarily wholly the simple story, that it was about the failure of maintenance, the failure of kind of tenant landlord management and all those other kind of more difficult, softer kind of things. And so I think it's often complicated about why public housing has failed, and I think I'm not always sure it's simply that the architects got it wrong, that it was shoddy construction. Not to say that there isn't bad architectural design and poor construction, but I think like many things, I mean, if you look at issues about high-rise apartments and cladding at the moment, the complexity about the cause of that and who's to blame and how to fix it is a kind of classic example. I think that these things are never quite as simple as blame bad materials or blame the designer.
I agree.
Okay. If there's no further questions, I suppose we will wrap this up and just thank everybody so much for coming along. I'll send out an email